Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's more relaxed corners. Tonight we're exploring something that might surprise you about medieval life. How people got drunk, what they drank, and why alcohol wasn't just about having a good time. It was literally a matter of survival, social status, and sometimes even spiritual enlightenment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, grab your favorite evening beverage, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's ease into our story. Picture this. You're living in 1347, somewhere in rural England. There's no coffee, no tea, no clean water you can trust, and definitely no Netflix to unwind with after a long day of, well, trying not to die from various medieval inconveniences. What do you reach for? Ale. Always ale. Or wine if you're fancy. Or mead if you're feeling particularly festive. In medieval times, getting drunk wasn't a weekend activity. It was Tuesday afternoon, and everyone from the local priest to your 6-year-old cousin was doing it. But before we dive into the frothy details, let's set the scene properly. Medieval Europe wasn't the grim, alcohol-free wasteland you might imagine from certain historical films. These people knew how to party, they just did it with a lot more dysentery and significantly fewer safety regulations. Let's start with a truth that might shock modern sensibilities. In medieval times, everyone drank alcohol. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Children, pregnant women, monks, nuns, kings, peasants, and probably the occasional farm animal that wandered too close to a fermenting barrel. This wasn't because medieval people were all functioning alcoholics, though some certainly were. It was because alcohol was often safer than water. Medieval water sources were, to put it mildly, questionable. Rivers doubled as sewers, wells were often contaminated, and the concept of water treatment was about as advanced as their understanding of germs, which is to say, non-existent. So instead of risking a deadly case of dysentery from the local stream, people reached for small beer, weak ale, or watered-down wine. These beverages had enough alcohol content to kill most harmful bacteria, but not enough to have you singing bawdy songs at your neighbour's cow every morning. The typical medieval person consumed between 1 and 3 gallons of ale per day. Yes, gallons. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 8 to 24 modern beer bottles daily. But remember, this wasn't modern beer with its 4 to 6% alcohol content. Medieval small beer typically hovered around 1 to 3% alcohol. Enough to purify, not enough to pickle your liver by age 30. Children started drinking this small beer as soon as they were weaned from breast milk. There are records of monasteries providing daily ale rations to boys as young as 7, and these weren't considered problematic or unusual. It was simply part of growing up medieval. Your morning started with bread and ale, your midday meal included ale, your evening meal featured ale, and if you were lucky enough to have a bedtime snack, well, that probably came with ale too. Women brewed most of this daily ale at home. Brewing was considered women's work, much like cooking or spinning, and every household had someone who knew how to turn grain into something drinkable. These weren't elaborate craft brewing operations, just basic fermentation using whatever grains were available, some water, and wild yeast captured from the air or transferred from previous batches. The process was simple but crucial. Grains, usually barley, but sometimes wheat, oats, or even acorns in desperate times, were malted by soaking them in water until they sprouted, then dried and ground. This was mixed with hot water, strained, and left to ferment. The whole process took about a week, and the result was a murky, somewhat nutritious beverage that tasted vaguely of bread and safety. But daily drinking was just the foundation. When medieval people wanted to actually get drunk, and they did, regularly and enthusiastically, they reached for stronger stuff. While small beer kept medieval people hydrated and reasonably healthy, it wasn't exactly party fuel. When they wanted to truly celebrate, commiserate, or simply forget that they lived in an era where a splinter could kill you, medieval people had options that would make modern bartenders nervous. Strong ale was the first step up. This was ale brewed with more grain, less water, and longer fermentation times. resulting in alcohol contents that could reach 8 to 12%. This was the stuff consumed at festivals, weddings, harvest celebrations, and those long winter evenings when everyone needed something to warm them from the inside out. Then there was wine, which occupied a special place in medieval drinking culture. Wine wasn't just alcohol. It was sophistication, spirituality, and status, all fermented into one bottle. The wealthy drank wine regularly. The middle classes saved it for special occasions, and the poor dreamed about it while nursing their ale. Medieval wine was quite different from modern varieties. For starters, it was often mixed with water, spices, honey, or herbs. Pure wine was considered too strong and potentially dangerous for regular consumption. The practice of mixing wine with water was so common that drinking unmixed wine was seen as either barbaric or a sign of serious problems. Spiced wine, called hippocras in medieval England and claret in France, was particularly popular among the wealthy. These were wines mixed with expensive spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, often sweetened with honey or sugar when available. The spices weren't just for flavour. They were believed to aid digestion and balance the body's humours, making the wine both more enjoyable and theoretically healthier. Mead, fermented honey wine, was another favourite for special occasions. Often called the drink of the gods, mead had deep cultural significance across medieval Europe. It was associated with fertility, celebration, and the afterlife. Viking warriors expected to drink mead in Valhalla, Celtic druids used it in religious ceremonies, and medieval newlyweds traditionally drank mead for a full month after their wedding, giving us the term honeymoon. Making mead was more complex than brewing ale because honey was expensive and the fermentation process was trickier. Honey had to be diluted with water, sometimes boiled to remove impurities, then fermented slowly over months or even years. The result could be incredibly potent, sometimes reaching 15 to 20% alcohol content. A few horns of good mead could have a medieval warrior seeing double before the evening's entertainment even began. But perhaps the most dangerous medieval drink was aqua vitae, literally water of life, an early form of distilled spirits. This was alcohol distilled from wine or grain mash, creating something approaching modern whiskey or brandy in strength. Distillation was a relatively new technology in medieval Europe, imported from the Islamic world around the 12th century, and aqua vitae was initially considered medicine rather than a recreational drink. Medieval physicians prescribed aqua vitae for everything from plague prevention to melancholy. They believed it could preserve life, cure diseases, and restore youth. Of course, anyone who's ever consumed straight spirits on an empty stomach knows that aqua vitae was more likely to make you forget you had problems than actually solve them. The strength of aqua vitae varied wildly depending on the distiller's skill and equipment. Some versions were barely stronger than wine, while others could probably fuel a lantern. There are accounts of people dying from drinking too much aqua vitae, not from alcohol poisoning as we'd understand it today, but from what medieval physicians described as internal burning, essentially drinking something closer to industrial alcohol than beverage alcohol. Medieval drinking wasn't just about what people drank, it was about where they drank it, and with whom. These social spaces shaped not just medieval nightlife, but medieval society itself. The tavern was the heart of medieval social life. Unlike modern bars, which primarily serve alcohol, medieval taverns were multi-purpose establishments that provided food, lodging, entertainment, and social networking all under one roof. They were part restaurant, part hotel, part theatre, and part community centre. Taverns were typically located along major roads or in town centres, making them natural gathering places for travellers, merchants, locals, and anyone else looking for company. The atmosphere was rowdy, crowded, and often chaotic. Imagine a space where farmers, pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, and occasional nobles all mixed together, sharing tables, stories, and increasingly questionable judgment as the evening progressed. The tavern keeper, often a woman called an ale wife, was a crucial figure in medieval society. She not only provided drinks and food, but served as an informal banker, message carrier, and social coordinator. Need to send word to the next town? The tavern keeper knew which travellers were headed that way. Need to find work? She knew which merchants were hiring. Need to settle a dispute? She'd have witnessed enough similar arguments to offer advice. The physical layout of taverns was designed for communal drinking. Most featured long wooden tables where strangers sat elbow to elbow, sharing benches and often sharing drinks. Privacy wasn't really an option. If you wanted to drink, you did it in the company of whoever else happened to be there. This created a democratic atmosphere where social barriers temporarily dissolved in alcohol and shared humanity. Alehouses were slightly different from taverns. While taverns offered full hospitality services, alehouses focused primarily on serving drinks to locals. These were neighborhood establishments where the same people gathered regularly, often after work or on market days. Alehouses were typically smaller, more intimate spaces where everyone knew everyone else's business, romantic entanglements, and drinking habits. The great halls of castles and manor houses represented the other end of the drinking spectrum. Here, alcohol consumption was formal, hierarchical, and ritualized. The lord of the manor sat at the high table, while servants, soldiers, and other dependents arranged themselves at lower tables according to strict social precedents. Drinking in great halls wasn't just about consumption, it was about display. The lord demonstrated his wealth and generosity by providing quality wine or ale to his followers. The followers demonstrated their loyalty by participating enthusiastically in communal toasts and drinking songs. Everyone's status was reinforced through what they drank, where they sat, and how much they were served. These great hall drinking sessions could last for hours. Medieval feasts often featured multiple courses of food, accompanied by multiple rounds of drinks, interspersed with entertainment like singing, storytelling, or musical performances. The alcohol helped lubricate what might otherwise have been awkward social interactions between people of different ranks. Monasteries had their own unique drinking culture. While we might imagine medieval monks as abstinent ascetics, most monasteries brewed their own ale and wine, both for daily consumption and for special occasions. Monastic brewing became highly sophisticated, with some monasteries developing recipes and techniques that influenced secular brewing for centuries. The monastery brewery was typically run by a monk designated as the cellarer, who was responsible for ensuring adequate supplies of ale for the community. Monks received daily ale rations just like everyone else. Typically a gallon per day for adult monks, with additional rations for feast days and special occasions. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing expertise. The Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris was renowned for its wine, while German monasteries developed some of the earliest beer styles that are still recognizable today. These monastic brewers had several advantages over secular brewers. They had more resources, more time to perfect their techniques, and access to expensive ingredients like hops and spices. Medieval drinking wasn't a casual, individual activity like modern drinking often is. It was deeply ritualized, with complex social rules about who drank what, when, and how. Understanding these rituals gives us insight into medieval society's values, hierarchies, and anxieties. The most important drinking ritual was the toast. Medieval toasts weren't simple cheers. They were formal declarations of loyalty, friendship, or respect. When someone offered you a drink, especially in a formal setting, refusing it could be interpreted as an insult or a sign of hostility. Accepting and reciprocating demonstrated good faith and social solidarity. The ceremonial drinking horn played a special role in these rituals. Horns couldn't be set down without spilling their contents, so drinking from a horn required commitment. You had to drain it completely before passing it on. This made horn drinking a test of both capacity and dedication. In warrior cultures, being unable to finish a horn of ale or mead could damage your reputation for fortitude. Drinking games were popular across all social levels. These ranged from simple contests of capacity, who could drink the most without falling down, to elaborate verbal challenges that required participants to compose poetry or songs while increasingly intoxicated. Some drinking games had educational purposes, helping young people memorize important stories, genealogies, or religious texts. The concept of buying rounds existed in medieval times, though it worked differently than today. In taverns, groups often pooled their money to purchase a large jug or barrel of ale that they shared. The person contributing the most money gained social prestige, while those contributing less might be expected to provide entertainment, news, or other non-monetary value to the group. Women's participation in public drinking varied by region and social class. In some areas, respectable women rarely appeared in taverns except as workers. In others, women participated freely in public drinking, especially during festivals or market days. Alewives, female tavern keepers, held special status as both participants in and controllers of drinking culture. Marriage celebrations involved elaborate drinking rituals. The bridal cup was passed between bride and groom, their families, and wedding guests as a symbol of the union between two families. Wedding ales, special brews created for the occasion, might be saved for months or even years before the ceremony. Some couples buried barrels of ale or mead when they became engaged, digging them up for their wedding feast. Funeral wakes also centered on communal drinking. The deceased's family was expected to provide ale or wine for mourners, and the quality of the drinks reflected both the family's respect for the dead and their social standing. These funeral drinks weren't just about grief. They were about celebrating the deceased's life and strengthening community bonds during difficult times. Religious festivals incorporated drinking into their observances. Christmas ale, Easter wine, and harvest festival drinks were blessed by priests and consumed as part of religious celebration. The line between sacred and secular drinking was often blurred, with alcohol serving both spiritual and social functions. Now let's get to the interesting part. What was it actually like to be drunk in the Middle Ages? The physical effects of alcohol haven't changed much over the centuries, but the social context, available remedies, and consequences of overindulgence were quite different from today. First, consider that medieval people had very different baseline health than modern people. Chronic malnutrition, intestinal parasites, and various vitamin deficiencies were common, all of which affect how alcohol is processed by the body. A malnourished person gets drunk faster and stays drunk longer than someone with a healthy diet. Medieval drinkers might have achieved significant intoxication with less alcohol than we'd expect. The types of alcohol also created different drinking experiences. Medieval ale and wine were cloudy, unfiltered, and full of sediments and impurities. This meant they provided more nutrients than modern alcohol. You were essentially drinking liquid bread, but also that they could cause stomach upset even in moderate quantities. Getting drunk on medieval ale might involve not just intoxication, but also digestive discomfort. Medieval hangover remedies were creative, if not always effective. Popular cures included drinking more alcohol, the hair of the dog approach, consuming raw eggs, bathing in cold water, or drinking concoctions made from herbs like willow bark, which actually contains a compound similar to aspirin. Some physicians recommended bloodletting to remove the corrupt humours caused by excessive drinking. The social consequences of drunkenness varied dramatically by social class. Nobles might be forgiven for occasional overindulgence, especially if it happened during appropriate celebrations. Merchants and craftsmen risked their reputations and business relationships if they drank too much too often. Peasants and labourers might lose their jobs or face physical punishment from their lords if drinking interfered with their work. Medieval law took a complex view of drunkenness. Public intoxication wasn't necessarily illegal, but crimes committed while drunk weren't excused by intoxication. In fact, some legal codes specified harsher punishments for crimes committed while drunk, reasoning that the perpetrator had chosen to impair his judgment. However, contracts signed while drunk could sometimes be voided, recognizing that alcohol affected decision-making capacity. The Church's attitude toward drinking was similarly nuanced. Moderate consumption was acceptable and even encouraged. Jesus had turned water into wine, after all. But drunkenness was considered a sin, one of the manifestations of the deadly sin of gluttony. Regular drunkards might face penance, public shaming, or exclusion from religious services. Violence and alcohol went hand in hand in medieval times, just as they do today. Tavern brawls were common enough that many establishments had specific rules about weapons. Patrons might be required to leave their swords and daggers at the door, or at least peace bond them so they couldn't be drawn quickly. Despite these precautions, alcohol-fueled violence was a regular feature of medieval life. Sexual behavior and alcohol were also linked, though medieval attitudes were different from modern ones. Alcohol was believed to increase sexual desire in men but decrease performance, leading to complicated social dynamics. Women who drank heavily were often assumed to be sexually promiscuous, a stereotype that could destroy their reputations and marriage prospects. Medieval medicine had elaborate theories about how alcohol affected the body. According to humoral theory, alcohol was hot and dry, making it useful for people with cold, wet constitutions, but dangerous for those who were already hot and dry. Physicians might prescribe specific types of alcohol for different ailments. Wine for melancholy, ale for digestive problems, mead for fertility issues. The process of getting drunk was often accompanied by specific foods designed to slow alcohol absorption or reduce its effects. Wealthy drinkers might consume bread, cheese, or nuts while drinking. Poor drinkers made do with whatever food they could afford, or simply drank on empty stomachs and dealt with the consequences. Sleep patterns were different too. Without artificial lighting, most people went to bed shortly after sunset and rose at dawn. Drinking sessions often began in late afternoon and continued into the evening, meaning people frequently went to bed drunk and woke up hungover at dawn. This created a cycle where hair of the dog remedies were genuinely necessary for people to function at their jobs. Understanding medieval drinking culture requires understanding its economics. Alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a commodity, a form of currency, and a marker of social status. The production, distribution, and consumption of alcoholic drinks shaped medieval economy in ways that might surprise modern readers. Grain was the foundation of medieval alcohol production, and grain prices determined alcohol prices. In years of good harvests, ale was cheap and plentiful. During famines, grain was too valuable as food to waste on brewing, making alcohol expensive and scarce. This created a boom and bust cycle in drinking culture. Feast years with abundant alcohol followed by lean years when even the wealthy drank sparingly. Brewing was one of the few industries where women could achieve economic independence. Alewives often started as widows brewing ale to support themselves, but successful brewers could become wealthy and influential members of their communities. Some medieval brewing operations employed dozens of workers and supplied ale to entire towns or regions. The guild system regulated alcohol production in many medieval cities. Brewers' guilds set quality standards, controlled prices, and restricted who could enter the trade. These guilds were powerful political forces that could influence city governments and trade policies. Guild membership provided social status and economic protection, but also required conformity to strict rules about ingredients, methods, and business practices. Taxation of alcohol was a major source of government revenue. Kings, nobles, and city councils all imposed various taxes on brewing, selling, and consuming alcohol. These taxes were often unpopular, but relatively easy to collect, since alcohol production was difficult to hide. Tax collectors became familiar figures in medieval taverns and breweries. International trade in wine created some of the medieval world's most important commercial relationships. English merchants imported wine from Bordeaux, Flemish traders brought wine from the Rhine Valley, and Italian merchants supplied wine to northern European markets. These wine trades generated enormous profits and financed exploration, colonization, and technological development. The relationship between alcohol and agriculture was complex. Brewers competed with bakers for grain supplies, driving up bread prices during brewing seasons. However, the spent grain from brewing was valuable animal feed, and alehouses provided ready markets for farmers' produce. Many rural alehouses were attached to farms, creating integrated agricultural operations. Credit and debt relationships often centered on alcohol. Tavern keepers extended credit to regular customers, farmers borrowed against future harvests to buy brewing supplies, and merchants used wine shipments as collateral for loans. These alcohol-based financial relationships created networks of obligation and trust that extended far beyond simple buyer-seller transactions. Wages were often paid partially in alcohol. Farm workers might receive daily ale rations as part of their compensation. Craftsmen's contracts frequently specified alcohol allowances. Soldiers and sailors were guaranteed rum, wine, or ale rations. This meant that alcohol served as both currency and commodity in medieval economics. The seasonality of alcohol production created complex storage and preservation challenges. Fresh ale spoiled quickly, so brewers had to balance production with demand carefully. Wine could be stored longer, but required expensive containers and storage facilities. Mead lasted well, but required substantial initial investment in honey. These storage requirements influenced everything from architectural design to international trade schedules. Quality control was a constant challenge in medieval alcohol production. Without modern sanitation or quality testing, contaminated or spoiled alcohol was common. Bad ale could make entire communities sick, while good ale could make a brewer's reputation and fortune. Customers developed sophisticated palates for detecting problems with alcohol, and brewers with reputations for consistent quality commanded premium prices. The medieval church's relationship with alcohol was far more complex than modern stereotypes suggest. Rather than prohibition or condemnation, the church developed a nuanced theology around drinking that influenced everything from daily life to international politics. Wine held special significance as the blood of Christ in Christian communion. This meant that wine production and consumption carried religious meaning beyond simple refreshment. Monasteries became major wine producers, both for sacramental use and for supporting their communities financially. Some of Europe's finest vineyards were established and maintained by religious orders. Monastic brewing traditions developed sophisticated techniques that influenced secular brewing for centuries. Monks had several advantages as brewers. They had time to perfect their methods, resources to experiment with expensive ingredients, and networks to share knowledge with other monasteries. Some monastic brewing recipes were closely guarded secrets that gave their communities competitive advantages in local markets. The church calendar shaped drinking patterns throughout medieval Europe. Feast days called for special ales and wines, while fasting periods restricted alcohol consumption. Lent, Advent, and other penitential seasons created cycles of abstinence and indulgence that affected everything from brewery production schedules to tavern profits. Saints associated with brewing and drinking became popular figures in medieval culture. Saint Arnold of Soissons was the patron saint of brewers. Saint Vincent was associated with winemaking, and Saint Bridget was said to have blessed ale production. These saints' feast days became occasions for special drinking celebrations that combined religious observance with alcohol consumption. Ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over many alcohol-related crimes and disputes. Priests who drank too much faced church discipline, marriage disputes involving alcohol were heard in church courts, and violations of church-mandated drinking restrictions were punished by religious authorities. This meant that church law significantly influenced drinking behavior throughout medieval society. The doctrine of transubstantiation created theological debates about alcohol's nature. If wine became the actual blood of Christ during communion, what did this mean for wine consumed outside religious services? Medieval theologians spent considerable time debating whether alcohol had inherent spiritual properties or whether its significance depended entirely on religious context. Pilgrimage routes often centered on monasteries and churches that produced exceptional wine or ale. Pilgrims expected good drinks as part of their religious journey, and religious sites competed to offer the best hospitality. This created economic incentives for religious communities to maintain high-quality alcohol production. Church teachings about moderation versus excess-shaped medieval attitudes toward drinking. The sin of gluttony included drunkenness, but moderate consumption was not only acceptable, but encouraged. This created a cultural framework that distinguished between appropriate and inappropriate drinking, influencing social norms and individual behavior. Religious festivals incorporated alcohol into their celebrations in ways that would seem strange to modern Christians. Christmas ales, Easter wines, and harvest blessing ceremonies all featured prominent alcohol consumption as part of religious observance. The boundaries between sacred and secular drinking were often blurred. The Church's political power influenced alcohol regulation and taxation. Religious authorities could lobby for or against taxes on alcohol. influence trade policies affecting wine imports, and use their moral authority to shape public attitudes toward drinking. In some regions, church officials held secular positions that gave them direct control over alcohol regulation. Medieval Europe wasn't a monolithic culture, and drinking practices varied significantly between regions. Climate, agriculture, trade relationships, and cultural traditions all influenced what people drank, how they drank it, and what drinking meant socially and economically. In Northern Europe, where grapes couldn't reliably grow, ale and mead dominated drinking culture. English ale was typically made from barley and had a distinctive hoppy flavour after hops became popular in the later medieval period. German and Flemish ales were often stronger and more varied, with different regions developing signature styles that influenced brewing traditions for centuries. The introduction of hops to Northern European brewing was a technological revolution that changed both the taste and preservation qualities of ale. Hopped beer lasted longer than unhopped ale, making it suitable for international trade and long-term storage. This innovation originated in Germanic regions and spread slowly westward, reaching England only in the late medieval period. Scandinavian countries developed unique fermented beverages adapted to their harsh climates. Mead remained popular longer in northern regions than elsewhere, partly because honey production was well suited to short growing seasons. Norwegian and Swedish brewers also experimented with fermented fish and dairy products, creating alcoholic beverages that were nutritionally valuable during long winters. Mediterranean regions were wine country, but medieval wine was quite different from modern varieties. Most wine was consumed within a year of production, before it could spoil. Sweet wines were popular because sugar helped preserve the wine and masked off flavors from primitive production methods. Spiced wines were common, both for flavor and because spices had preservative properties. Italian wine culture was particularly sophisticated, with different regions developing distinctive styles and production methods. The Italian city-states competed to produce the finest wines, leading to innovations in cultivation, fermentation, and storage. Italian wine merchants became wealthy and powerful figures who influenced politics and international trade. French wine regions began developing their famous reputations during the medieval period. Bordeaux wines were particularly popular in England due to political connections between the English crown and French territories. Burgundy developed a reputation for exceptional quality that attracted wealthy customers from across Europe. These regional wine identities became important economic and cultural assets. Spanish wine production was influenced by Islamic traditions during the period of Muslim rule. After the Reconquista, Spanish Christians adopted some Islamic techniques while developing their own distinctive styles. Spanish wines became important exports to Northern Europe and the Americas. Eastern European drinking cultures were influenced by both Western European and Middle Eastern traditions. Hungarian mead and wine production was sophisticated, while Polish and Russian regions developed their own ale traditions. The Orthodox Church's different attitudes toward alcohol created somewhat different drinking cultures in Eastern versus Western Christian regions. Trade relationships significantly influenced regional drinking preferences. English merchants' connections with Bordeaux made French wine popular in England. Flemish traders brought German ales to French markets. Italian merchants introduced Mediterranean wines to Northern European courts. These trade relationships created cosmopolitan drinking cultures in major commercial cities. Climate change during the medieval period affected regional drinking patterns. The medieval warm period allowed grape cultivation further north than previously possible, while the Little Ice Age, that began in the late medieval period, pushed wine production southward again. These climate shifts forced regions to adapt their drinking cultures to changing agricultural conditions. Political relationships influenced alcohol trade and consumption. Wars could disrupt wine imports, forcing regions to develop alternatives. Political alliances created preferential trade relationships that shaped which wines and ales were available in different markets. Royal marriages often included dowries of wine or brewing equipment, spreading regional traditions across political boundaries. Medieval alcohol production might seem primitive compared to modern industrial brewing and winemaking, but it actually involved sophisticated technology and techniques that laid the foundation for modern alcohol production. Understanding this technology helps us appreciate both the complexity of medieval society and the challenges faced by medieval drinkers. Malting, the process of converting grain starches to fermentable sugars, was the first crucial step in ale production. Medieval maltsters developed techniques for controlling the sprouting process that remained essentially unchanged until modern times. They learned to time the soaking, sprouting, and drying phases precisely to maximize sugar content while minimizing grain loss. The malt house was a specialized building designed for optimal malting conditions. These buildings featured carefully designed ventilation systems, drainage, and drying kilns that could process large quantities of grain efficiently. Successful malt houses were valuable commercial operations that supplied brewers across wide regions. Brewing equipment was more sophisticated than many people realize. Large commercial breweries used copper kettles that could hold hundreds of gallons, wooden fermentation vessels designed for optimal temperature control, and complex systems of pipes and channels for moving liquids. Some medieval breweries were industrial operations that employed dozens of workers and produced thousands of gallons of ale annually. Yeast management was perhaps the most mysterious aspect of medieval brewing to modern eyes. Medieval brewers didn't understand the microbiology of fermentation, but they developed practical techniques for maintaining yeast cultures that were remarkably effective. They saved sediment from successful batches, transferred it to new brews, and even traded yeast cultures with other brewers. Wine production technology was equally sophisticated. Medieval winemakers developed techniques for crushing grapes, controlling fermentation temperature, and aging wine that produced high-quality results. Monastery vineyards often led innovation in wine production, developing new grape varieties and production methods that influenced secular winemaking. Storage technology was crucial for both ale and wine production. Medieval coopers developed sophisticated barrel-making techniques that created containers suitable for fermentation, transportation, and long-term storage. Different woods were used for different purposes: oak for wine aging, ash for ale storage, pine for temporary containers. Quality control in medieval alcohol production relied on human senses rather than scientific testing. Experienced brewers and vintners developed extraordinary abilities to detect problems with their products by sight, smell, and taste. They could identify contamination, determine optimal aging times, and adjust production processes based on subtle sensory cues. Temperature control was achieved through careful site selection and building design rather than mechanical refrigeration. Breweries and wine cellars were built underground or into hillsides to maintain stable temperatures. Some operations used natural ice or cold springs to control fermentation temperatures during warm weather. Filtration and clarification techniques were primitive but effective. Medieval alcohol producers used everything from egg whites to fish bladders to clarify their products. They developed settling techniques that removed sediments and impurities, though most medieval alcohol remained cloudier than modern equivalents. Distribution technology focused on transportation and preservation challenges. Medieval merchants developed techniques for moving barrels and bottles across long distances using wagons, boats, and pack animals. They learned to package alcohol to minimize spoilage during transportation and storage. Innovation in medieval alcohol technology often came from international trade and cultural exchange. Islamic distillation techniques reached Europe through Spain and trade relationships. Hopping technology spread from Germanic regions westward. New grape varieties and winemaking techniques traveled along trade routes and through monastery networks. The relationship between alcohol technology and other medieval technologies was complex and interconnected. Advances in metallurgy improved brewing equipment. Developments in carpentry and cooperage enhanced storage capabilities. Agricultural innovations increased the quality and quantity of raw materials available for alcohol production. Medieval medicine and alcohol had a complex, intertwined relationship that might surprise modern readers. Far from viewing alcohol as simply recreational or potentially harmful, medieval physicians considered various alcoholic beverages essential medical tools. Their understanding of how alcohol affected the body was based on entirely different theoretical frameworks than modern medicine, leading to some fascinating and sometimes dangerous practices. The foundation of medieval medical thinking about alcohol was humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. According to this theory, the human body contained four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which needed to remain in balance for good health. Each humour was associated with certain qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry. Alcohol was generally considered hot and dry, making it useful for treating conditions associated with cold and wet humours. This meant physicians prescribed wine for melancholy, caused by excess black bile, ale for digestive problems, caused by excess phlegm, and various alcoholic preparations for a wide range of ailments. The type of alcohol, its preparation, and its timing were all considered crucial for therapeutic effectiveness. Wine held a special place in medieval medicine because of its association with blood in Christian theology and its supposed similarity to human blood in colour and warmth. Physicians prescribed wine for anemia, weakness, and what we would now recognize as depression. Red wine was considered more potent than white wine for most medical purposes, though white wine was preferred for certain digestive ailments. Herbal wines were particularly important in medieval pharmacology. Physicians created complex preparations by steeping medicinal herbs in wine for weeks or months. These herbal wines combined the supposed benefits of alcohol with the therapeutic properties of various plants. Popular ingredients included wormwood for digestive problems, rosemary for memory enhancement, and sage for general health maintenance. The dosing of medicinal alcohol was taken very seriously. Medieval medical texts provided detailed instructions about how much alcohol to prescribe for different conditions, different patient types, and different times of day or year. Too little was considered ineffective, while too much could disrupt the patient's humoral balance in dangerous ways. Age and gender significantly influenced medical alcohol prescriptions. Children were given very small doses of weak wine or ale for specific conditions. Pregnant women received different alcohol preparations than other women. Elderly patients were prescribed different types and quantities of alcohol than young adults. These variations reflected medieval beliefs about how different types of people processed alcohol differently. Seasonal prescriptions were also important. Medieval physicians believed that the body's humoral balance changed with the seasons, requiring different treatments throughout the year. Summer ale prescriptions differed from winter wine recommendations. Spring treatments involving fresh herbs in alcohol were considered especially important for rebalancing the body after winter. Medieval surgery often involved alcohol as both anesthetic and antiseptic. Surgeons gave patients wine or aqua vitae before operations to dull pain and calm nerves. They also used alcohol to clean wounds and surgical instruments, though they didn't understand the scientific basis for alcohol's antiseptic properties. Archaeological evidence from medieval hospitals shows that surgical success rates were higher in institutions that used alcohol liberally. Mental health conditions were frequently treated with alcohol-based remedies. Melancholy, what we might now call depression, was thought to result from an excess of cold, dry black bile. Physicians prescribed warm, moist remedies including spiced wine, honeyed ale, and various herbal preparations in alcohol. While these treatments couldn't address underlying causes of mental illness, they probably did provide temporary relief from symptoms. The concept of medicinal drinking extended beyond formal medical practice into folk medicine and self-treatment. Many people maintained personal stocks of herbal wines, medicinal ales, and other alcohol-based remedies. Recipe collections from medieval households often included instructions for preparing these therapeutic drinks, alongside cooking recipes and household management advice. Medieval physicians also recognized that alcohol could be harmful in excess. They wrote extensively about the dangers of habitual drunkenness, describing symptoms that we would now recognize as alcoholism, liver disease, and various nutritional deficiencies. However, their treatments for alcohol-related problems often involved different types of alcohol rather than abstinence. The placebo effect played a significant role in alcohol-based medieval medicine. Patients who believed in their treatments often experienced real improvements, especially for conditions with psychological components. The ritual aspects of taking medicinal alcohol, special preparations, precise timing, ceremonial consumption, enhanced these psychological benefits. Medical alcohol preparations were often extremely expensive, putting them out of reach for poor patients. This created a two-tiered medical system where wealthy patients received complex, alcohol-based treatments, while poor patients relied on simpler remedies. However, some charitable institutions and monasteries provided free medical alcohol to indigent patients as part of their religious duties. Quality standards for alcohol were enforced through a combination of guild self-regulation and municipal oversight. Ale tasters were appointed officials who tested the quality and strength of ale sold in their jurisdictions. These officials had the authority to fine brewers who produced substandard products, confiscate contaminated alcohol, and even shut down operations that repeatedly violated standards. Tavern licensing was another important area of alcohol regulation. Tavern keepers needed licenses from local authorities, and these licenses came with specific obligations. Licensed tavern keepers were required to provide food and lodging to travelers, maintain order in their establishments, and report suspicious activities to authorities. In return, they received protection from competition and official support in collecting debts. Drinking-related crimes were categorized differently than modern legal systems might expect. Public drunkenness was not necessarily illegal, but disorderly conduct while drunk certainly was. The key distinction was whether drinking behavior disrupted social order or interfered with other people's activities. A drunk person sleeping peacefully in a tavern corner was generally left alone, while a drunk person starting fights or making noise faced legal consequences. Violence committed while intoxicated often received harsher punishments than violence committed while sober. Medieval legal theory held that people who chose to drink heavily were responsible for the consequences of their impaired judgment. This principle applied to everything from tavern brawls to domestic violence to property damage. Some legal codes specifically prescribed enhanced penalties for crimes committed while drunk. Debt and credit relationships involving alcohol were common sources of legal disputes. Tavern keepers extended credit to regular customers, brewers sold ale on credit to retailers, and customers sometimes paid for drinks with promises of future payment. When these credit relationships went bad, the resulting legal disputes could be complex and acrimonious. Marriage and alcohol intersected in medieval law in several important ways. Marriages contracted while one or both parties were severely intoxicated could sometimes be annulled, though proving intoxication after the fact was difficult. Domestic violence cases often involved alcohol, and legal remedies reflected contemporary beliefs about men's authority over their wives and alcohol's role in reducing self-control. Property crimes involving alcohol were taken seriously because alcohol had significant economic value. Stealing ale, wine, or brewing equipment was punished similarly to stealing other valuable commodities. However, some jurisdictions recognized that desperate hunger might drive people to steal small amounts of ale, and penalties for minor alcohol theft were sometimes reduced accordingly. Religious law also governed alcohol-related behavior. Church courts had jurisdiction over clerical drinking, marriage disputes involving alcohol, and violations of religious drinking restrictions. Priests who drank too much faced ecclesiastical discipline that could include suspension from religious duties, required penance, or even defrocking in extreme cases. The intersection of secular and religious law regarding alcohol created complex jurisdictional issues. A monk who got drunk and started a fight might face both ecclesiastical discipline from his monastery and secular prosecution from local authorities. Married couples disputing over one spouse's drinking might find themselves in both church courts and secular courts simultaneously. Regional variations in alcohol law reflected different cultural attitudes and practical concerns. Wine-producing regions had different regulations than ale-producing regions. Urban areas with many taverns had different rules than rural areas where most drinking happened in homes. Border regions dealing with alcohol smuggling had different enforcement priorities than inland areas. While alcohol was central to medieval life in positive ways, it also caused significant social problems that medieval societies struggled to address. Alcoholism, domestic violence, poverty, and crime all had connections to excessive drinking that medieval people recognized but had limited tools to combat. Chronic alcoholism was well documented in medieval sources, though it wasn't understood as a medical condition in the modern sense. Medieval physicians recognized that some people seemed unable to control their drinking despite obvious health and social consequences. They described physical symptoms, including tremors, digestive problems, and mental deterioration that we would now associate with long-term alcohol abuse. The social consequences of chronic drinking were often devastating for medieval families. A husband or father who drank excessively could quickly impoverish his family by spending money on alcohol instead of necessities. Since men controlled most family finances in medieval society, wives and children had limited legal recourse when the family breadwinner became an alcoholic. Domestic violence and alcohol were closely linked in medieval society, just as they are today. Court records and literary sources provide abundant evidence of men beating their wives and children while drunk. However, medieval legal systems offered limited protection for victims of domestic violence, and alcohol was often seen as an explanation rather than an excuse for violent behavior. Criminal behavior and alcohol were closely connected. Tavern fights were common enough that many establishments had specific rules about weapons and behavior. Theft, assault, and sexual crimes all occurred more frequently in and around drinking establishments. Some habitual criminals were known to use alcohol deliberately to reduce their inhibitions before committing crimes. Debt and financial ruin often resulted from excessive drinking. People who spent too much money on alcohol could find themselves unable to pay rent, buy food, or maintain their businesses. Medieval credit systems were unforgiving, and people who defaulted on debts due to drinking problems could lose their homes, their livelihoods, and their social standing. The cycle of poverty and alcohol abuse was well established in medieval times. Poor people sometimes drank to forget their problems, but drinking made their financial situations worse, leading to more drinking. Breaking this cycle was difficult without institutional support that generally didn't exist in medieval society. Religious institutions provided some support for people with drinking problems, but their approaches reflected medieval theological understanding rather than modern addiction treatment concepts. Monasteries might offer shelter and structure for people trying to overcome drinking problems, but the emphasis was on moral reformation rather than medical treatment. Some medieval authorities attempted to regulate drinking through sumptuary laws that restricted alcohol consumption based on social class. These laws were generally ineffective because they were difficult to enforce and didn't address the underlying causes of problem drinking. They also reflected class bias rather than genuine concern for public health. The economic costs of alcohol abuse affected entire communities. Productive workers who became alcoholics stopped contributing to economic output. Families impoverished by alcohol abuse became burdens on charitable institutions. Crime and violence associated with drinking created costs for law enforcement and judicial systems. Medieval attempts to address alcohol abuse were limited by lack of understanding about addiction as a medical condition. Most approaches focused on moral exhortation, religious conversion, or legal punishment rather than treatment. While these approaches occasionally succeeded, they did little to address the underlying issues that led to problem drinking. Medieval literature provides rich insights into drinking culture, revealing attitudes, practices, and concerns that official records might not capture. From heroic epics to satirical poetry, from religious texts to popular songs, alcohol appears throughout medieval literary culture as both blessing and curse, social lubricant and source of conflict. The epic tradition celebrated alcohol as part of heroic culture. In Beowulf, the mead hall serves as the center of social life, where warriors gather to feast, drink, and hear stories of great deeds. The hall represents civilization itself, a place of light, warmth, and fellowship surrounded by the darkness of the wilderness. Sharing mead creates bonds between warriors and their lords, making alcohol consumption a fundamental aspect of heroic society. Courtly literature often portrayed refined drinking as a mark of civilization and sophistication. Noble characters drank fine wines from golden cups while discussing poetry, philosophy, and love. These idealized drinking scenes contrasted with the rougher tavern scenes of popular literature, reinforcing class distinctions and cultural hierarchies. Drinking songs were a major category of medieval popular culture. These ranged from simple tavern choruses that anyone could sing while drunk to complex compositions that required considerable skill to perform. Many drinking songs combined humor with social commentary, allowing people to express frustrations and criticisms that might be dangerous in other contexts. The tradition of Goliardic poetry, composed by wandering scholars and clerics, frequently celebrated drinking and criticized religious and secular authority. These poems combined learning with irreverence, using classical literary forms to describe tavern life and drunken adventures. The most famous collection, the Carmina Burana, includes numerous drinking songs that reveal the gap between official religious ideals and actual clerical behavior. Allegory and symbolism in medieval literature often employed alcohol imagery to represent abstract concepts. Wine might symbolize divine grace, spiritual wisdom, or earthly pleasure depending on context. Beer could represent common humanity, simple pleasures, or base materialism. These symbolic uses of alcohol imagery helped authors communicate complex ideas to audiences familiar with drinking culture. Women's roles in medieval drinking culture are often revealed through literary sources rather than official records. Female characters in literature run taverns, brew ale, serve wine, and participate in drinking rituals. These literary representations suggest that women's involvement in alcohol culture was more extensive and varied than formal historical records might indicate. The contrast between idealized and realistic portrayals of drinking in medieval literature reflects tension between social aspirations and actual behavior. Heroic literature portrayed noble drinking as elegant and controlled, while satirical literature showed the messy realities of actual medieval drinking. These contrasting representations help modern readers understand both medieval ideals and medieval realities. Regional variations in medieval literature reveal different drinking cultures across Europe. Germanic literature emphasized mead and ale, drinking in warrior halls, while Mediterranean literature focused more on wine and its associations with learning and sophistication. These literary differences reflect actual cultural variations in how different societies understood and practiced alcohol consumption. The physical culture of medieval drinking, the cups, bowls, horns, and specialized equipment used for consuming alcohol, reveals important insights into social hierarchy, technological capability, and cultural values. These objects weren't just functional items, they were symbols of status, artistic expression, and social belonging. Drinking horns held special significance in medieval culture, particularly in Northern European societies with strong Germanic influences. Made from cattle, buffalo, or even elephant ivory, these horns couldn't be set down without spilling their contents, requiring drinkers to consume everything at once. This made horn drinking a test of capacity and commitment that reinforced warrior culture values. The decoration and size of drinking horns indicated their owner's status and wealth. Simple horns used by common people might have basic carved designs or metal bands around the rim. Wealthy nobles owned elaborately decorated horns with silver or gold fittings, precious stone inlays, and complex carved scenes depicting mythological or historical events. Horn drinking rituals were important social practices. The horn was passed from person to person in order of rank, with each drinker expected to consume a significant portion before passing it on. Failing to drink appropriately could be interpreted as disrespect or weakness. These rituals reinforced social hierarchies while creating shared experiences that bonded groups together. Wooden cups and bowls were the most common drinking vessels for ordinary people. Made from various woods, including oak, ash, and maple, these vessels were relatively inexpensive and durable. Skilled woodworkers created turned cups with thin walls and smooth finishes that were both functional and attractive. The wood's natural properties could even influence the flavor of the drinks consumed from them. Ceramic drinking vessels became increasingly sophisticated throughout the medieval period. Early medieval pottery was often rough and utilitarian, but later medieval ceramics featured complex glazes, decorative patterns, and specialized forms designed for different types of drinks. German stoneware and English earthenware were particularly renowned for their quality and durability. Metal drinking vessels were luxury items that demonstrated wealth and status. Silver and gold cups were reserved for the wealthiest nobles and religious institutions. Bronze and pewter vessels were more common among the merchant classes. These metal vessels could be elaborately decorated with engravings, embossing, and precious stone settings that made them valuable works of art, as well as functional objects. Glass drinking vessels were extremely rare and expensive in most of medieval Europe. Venetian glassmakers developed sophisticated techniques that produced beautiful and delicate drinking glasses, but these were luxury items available only to the very wealthy. The rarity of glass vessels made them particularly prized possessions that might be passed down through generations as family heirlooms. Communal drinking vessels were important for group bonding and social rituals. Large bowls or pitchers were filled with ale, wine, or mead and passed around groups of drinkers. These shared vessels reinforced community solidarity and ensured that everyone participated equally in drinking rituals. The act of sharing drinks from common vessels created symbolic bonds between participants. Specialized serving equipment accompanied drinking vessels in wealthy households. Elaborate pitchers, ladles, and strainers were used to serve drinks ceremonially. Some households owned specialized warming devices for heating wine or ale during cold weather. These serving pieces were often as decorative and valuable as the drinking vessels themselves. The decoration and symbolism of drinking vessels carried important cultural meanings. Religious symbols on church vessels reinforced the spiritual significance of communion wine. Heraldic designs on noble drinking vessels proclaimed family identity and political allegiances. Even simple decorative patterns on common drinking vessels could carry meanings related to protection, fertility, or good fortune. Regional variations in drinking vessel styles reflected different cultural traditions and available materials. Scandinavian drinking vessels often featured Norse mythological themes and designs. Mediterranean regions produced vessels influenced by classical and Islamic artistic traditions. Celtic regions maintained distinctive artistic styles that appeared on both utilitarian and luxury drinking vessels. The care and maintenance of drinking vessels was an important household responsibility, especially for valuable pieces. Silver and gold vessels required regular polishing to maintain their appearance. Wooden vessels needed to be kept clean and dry to prevent cracking and decay. Ceramic vessels had to be handled carefully to avoid chips and breaks that could make them unusable. The loss or destruction of valuable drinking vessels could have serious social and economic consequences. Family heirloom drinking vessels represented not just material wealth, but also ancestral connections and social status. Their loss could diminish a family's standing in the community and eliminate valuable assets that might have been used as collateral for loans or trade. Medieval drinking patterns were closely tied to seasonal cycles in ways that modern urban dwellers might find difficult to understand. The availability of ingredients, the demands of agricultural work, religious observances, and even the weather all influenced when, what, and how much medieval people drank throughout the year. Spring brought renewed brewing activity after the relative dormancy of winter. Fresh water from melting snow and spring rains provided excellent brewing water, while the warming weather created better conditions for fermentation. However, spring was also a time of scarcity, as stored grains were running low and new crops weren't yet ready for harvest. This created tension between the desire to brew fresh ale and the need to conserve precious grain supplies. Spring ales were often lighter and less alcoholic than winter brews, partly due to grain shortages and partly because the warming weather reduced the need for high-calorie warming drinks. Brewers might supplement grain with herbs, roots, and other foraged ingredients that became available as winter ended. Some of these additions had medicinal properties, making spring ales part of seasonal health regimens. The brewing of special Easter ales was an important spring tradition in many regions. These ales were blessed by priests and consumed as part of Easter celebrations. The timing of Easter, which varies each year based on lunar cycles, meant that Easter ale production had to be carefully planned to coincide with the religious calendar. Summer presented both opportunities and challenges for medieval drinkers. The warm weather increased demand for refreshing drinks, but it also created preservation problems for ales and wines. Summer ales were typically consumed quickly after brewing, as they spoiled rapidly in the heat. This led to patterns of intensive brewing, followed by rapid consumption. Harvest festivals in late summer and early autumn were major drinking occasions that celebrated successful crop collection and prepared communities for winter. These festivals featured special harvest ales brewed from the first grains of the new crop. The quality of these ales was seen as an omen for the coming year. Good ale from the new harvest suggested prosperity, while poor ale warned of difficult times ahead. The grape harvest in wine-producing regions created its own seasonal drinking patterns. Fresh grape juice was consumed immediately after pressing, often in large quantities before fermentation could begin. New wine was ready for drinking within weeks of harvest, creating a brief period of abundant, cheap wine that was celebrated with festivals and communal drinking. Autumn was the ideal time for brewing winter ales and laying down wines for aging. The cooling weather reduced spoilage risks, while the abundance of fresh grain and fruit from harvest provided high-quality ingredients. This was when medieval brewers and vintners did their most important work, creating the alcohol supplies that would sustain their communities through winter. Winter drinking patterns were shaped by the need for warming, high-calorie beverages that could help people survive cold weather and limited food supplies. Winter ales were typically stronger and more nutritious than summer brews, providing both alcohol and essential calories. Spiced wines and heated drinks became popular as people sought ways to warm themselves from the inside out. The Christmas season was the peak of medieval winter drinking, with special ales, wines, and meads prepared specifically for holiday celebrations. Christmas ale was often the strongest and most elaborate brew of the year, made with the finest ingredients available and sometimes aged for months before consumption. The 12 days of Christmas provided an excuse for sustained celebration and drinking that helped break the monotony of winter. Religious observances created their own seasonal drinking patterns that sometimes conflicted with agricultural cycles. Lent required abstinence from alcohol for devout Christians, creating a period of reduced consumption just when spring brewing was beginning. Advent had similar restrictions, though they were less strictly observed. These religious restrictions influenced brewing schedules and created anticipation for the return of normal drinking after periods of abstinence. The availability of different types of alcohol varied seasonally based on production cycles and storage capabilities. Fresh ale was most abundant in autumn after harvest, while aged wines were typically opened in winter and spring when fresh alternatives weren't available. Mead production followed honey harvest cycles, making it most plentiful in late summer and autumn. Weather patterns could dramatically affect seasonal drinking patterns. Harsh winters might force people to consume their alcohol supplies more rapidly for warmth and calories, while mild winters allowed for conservation. Wet summers could ruin grain crops and reduce brewing, while drought could affect both grain and grape production. Medieval alcohol wasn't just a local product. It was one of the most important international trade commodities, creating commercial networks that spanned continents and influenced everything from diplomacy to exploration to technological development. Understanding this trade helps reveal the global connections that shaped medieval society. Wine was perhaps the most valuable alcohol trade commodity, with certain regions developing international reputations for quality that commanded premium prices in distant markets. French wines from Bordeaux became particularly important in English markets due to political connections between English kings and French territories. This trade relationship influenced both English and French foreign policy for centuries. The English wine trade with Gascony was so important that it shaped naval policy and military strategy. English merchants needed naval protection for their wine ships, while French producers depended on English customers for their prosperity. When political tensions threatened this trade, both sides suffered economically, creating pressure for diplomatic solutions to political conflicts. Mead and honey-based alcohols were important trade items in northern and eastern European markets where grapes couldn't be grown reliably. Polish and Lithuanian mead found markets in Germanic regions, while Scandinavian honey wines were traded throughout the Baltic region. These trades often involved barter rather than money, with alcohol exchanged for furs, amber, and other regional specialties. The alcohol trade required sophisticated logistics and preservation techniques. Wine and ale had to be transported in barrels that could withstand long journeys by ship and wagon. Merchants developed techniques for preventing spoilage during transport, including proper barrel construction, optimal loading methods, and careful route planning to minimize time in transit. Credit and banking systems developed partly to support international alcohol trade. Italian banking houses financed wine shipments from France to England, while northern European merchants used letters of credit to purchase wine from Mediterranean producers. These financial instruments helped create the commercial banking systems that supported broader medieval economic development. Alcohol smuggling was a persistent problem that challenged medieval authorities. High taxes on imported wine and ale created incentives for merchants to avoid official ports and tax collectors. Smugglers developed sophisticated techniques for concealing alcohol shipments and bribing officials, creating underground commercial networks that operated parallel to legitimate trade. Quality control in international alcohol trade was a constant challenge. Buyers couldn't easily verify the quality of wines or ales before purchase, leading to disputes and damaged reputations. Some merchants developed brands and quality guarantees that helped establish trust with distant customers. Monastery-produced wines and ales often commanded premium prices because religious institutions had reputations for honest dealing. Currency exchange complications affected alcohol trade, as different regions used different monetary systems. Merchants had to understand multiple currency systems and exchange rates, while dealing with the risks of currency fluctuations during long trading voyages. Some alcohol trades were conducted through barter rather than money to avoid these complications. Political relationships significantly influenced alcohol trade patterns. Wars could disrupt established trade routes and create shortages in traditional markets. Political alliances might create preferential trade arrangements that favored certain producers over others. Royal marriages sometimes included provisions about alcohol trade between the newly connected kingdoms. Seasonal patterns in alcohol trade reflected both production cycles and navigation limitations. Wine shipments from Mediterranean regions typically occurred in autumn after harvest, while beer exports from northern regions might be timed to avoid summer heat that could spoil the products. Winter weather and rough seas created additional complications for merchants trying to move alcohol across long distances. The profits from alcohol trade were substantial enough to influence exploration and colonization. European merchants sought new sources of wine, grapes, and brewing grains in distant lands, while also looking for new markets for their products. The alcohol trade helped finance expeditions that led to the European colonization of the Americas and other regions. The relationship between alcohol and gender in medieval society was complex and multifaceted, influencing everything from daily household routines to public social interactions to legal rights and responsibilities. Understanding these gender dynamics provides crucial insights into both medieval drinking culture and medieval society more broadly. Women's roles in alcohol production were extensive and economically important, though often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. Most household brewing was done by women, making them the primary producers of the alcohol that sustained medieval communities. This gave women specialized knowledge and skills that were essential for family survival and community well-being. The alewife was a recognized and often respected figure in medieval communities. These women operated commercial brewing businesses that supplied ale to their neighborhoods and to travelers. Successful alewives could achieve considerable economic independence and social influence, though they also faced regulations and restrictions that male-dominated craft guilds imposed on female entrepreneurs. Brewing knowledge was typically passed down from mothers to daughters, creating female networks of expertise that paralleled male craft traditions. Young women learned not just the technical aspects of brewing, but also the business skills needed to operate successful brewing enterprises. This knowledge gave women a form of economic power that was relatively rare in medieval society. However, women's participation in commercial alcohol production was increasingly restricted as the medieval period progressed. Male-dominated brewers' guilds gradually excluded women from large-scale commercial brewing, limiting them to smaller household operations. This process reflected broader trends toward limiting women's economic opportunities and reinforcing male control over profitable trades. Drinking behavior was heavily gendered in medieval society, with different expectations and restrictions for men and women. Men were generally expected to be able to drink substantial quantities without losing control, as alcohol tolerance was associated with masculinity and social competence. Women, particularly those of higher social status, were expected to drink more moderately and maintain proper decorum even when drinking. The double standard regarding alcohol and sexual behavior was particularly pronounced. Men who drank heavily might be criticized for wasting money or neglecting responsibilities, but their sexual behavior while intoxicated was rarely questioned. Women who drank heavily were assumed to be sexually promiscuous, and female drunkenness was strongly associated with moral corruption and social deviance. Public drinking spaces were predominantly male environments where women's participation was limited and regulated. Respectable women might appear in taverns as workers or during special occasions, but regular female customers were often assumed to be prostitutes or women of questionable reputation. This gendered division of drinking spaces reinforced broader patterns of male dominance in public life. Marriage negotiations sometimes included provisions about alcohol consumption and brewing responsibilities. Prospective husbands might be evaluated based on their drinking habits and ability to provide alcohol for the household. Prospective wives were often assessed based on their brewing skills and their ability to manage household alcohol supplies efficiently. Widowhood sometimes provided women with new opportunities in alcohol-related businesses. Widows who inherited brewing operations from their husbands might continue running these businesses independently, though they often faced pressure to remarry or transfer control to male relatives. Some widows used brewing businesses to maintain economic independence and avoid remarriage. The cultural symbolism of alcohol reflected and reinforced gender stereotypes. Wine was often associated with refinement and spirituality, qualities that were considered appropriate for upper-class women. Beer and ale were associated with earthiness and physicality, making them more appropriate for men and working-class women. These symbolic associations influenced who was expected to drink what in different social contexts. Women's participation in drinking rituals varied significantly by region and social class. In some contexts, women participated fully in toasting, communal drinking, and alcohol-related celebrations. In others, women's participation was limited to serving alcohol to men rather than consuming it themselves. These variations reflected broader cultural differences in gender roles and expectations. Medieval medicine relied heavily on alcohol-based preparations for treating a wide range of conditions, reflecting both practical effectiveness and theoretical medical frameworks that viewed alcohol as having powerful therapeutic properties. This medical use of alcohol was far more sophisticated and systematic than modern people might expect. The theoretical foundation for medical alcohol use was humoral theory, which held that illness resulted from imbalances between the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Alcohol was classified as hot and dry, making it useful for treating conditions caused by excess cold and wet humors. This theoretical framework guided physicians in prescribing specific types of alcohol for different medical conditions. Wine held a special place in medieval medical practice because of its color similarity to blood and its supposed warming properties. Red wine was particularly valued for treating what medieval physicians called diseases of deficiency, conditions like anemia, weakness, and depression that were thought to result from insufficient blood or vital heat. White wine was considered more appropriate for digestive ailments and certain types of fever. Herbal wines were among the most important pharmaceutical preparations in medieval medicine. These were created by steeping medicinal herbs in wine for extended periods, often months, to extract the therapeutic properties of the plants. Popular herbal wine preparations included wormwood wine for digestive problems, sage wine for memory enhancement, and chamomile wine for anxiety and insomnia. The preparation of herbal wines was taken very seriously by medieval physicians and apothecaries. They developed detailed recipes that specified exact quantities of herbs, types of wine, steeping times, and storage conditions. Some herbal wine preparations were aged for years before use, creating complex flavor profiles and supposedly enhanced therapeutic effects. Aqua vitae, distilled spirits, was initially considered purely medicinal rather than recreational. Medieval physicians believed that distillation concentrated the vital essence of wine, creating a substance that could literally extend life and cure otherwise incurable diseases. Early medical texts claimed that aqua vitae could prevent plague, heal wounds, and restore youth. The dosing of medicinal alcohol was carefully calculated based on the patient's age, gender, constitution, and specific condition. Medical texts provided detailed instructions about how much alcohol to prescribe, when to administer it, and how to adjust dosages based on patient response. Too little was considered ineffective, while too much could disrupt the patient's humoral balance dangerously. Surgical procedures often involved alcohol as both anesthetic and antiseptic. Surgeons gave patients wine or aqua vitae before operations to reduce pain and anxiety. They also used alcohol to clean wounds and surgical instruments, though they didn't understand the scientific basis for alcohol's antiseptic properties. Archaeological evidence suggests that surgical success rates were higher in institutions that used alcohol liberally. Mental health conditions were frequently treated with alcohol-based remedies. Melancholy, the medieval term for what we might now call depression, was thought to result from excess cold, dry black bile. Physicians prescribed warm, moist remedies including spiced wine and honeyed ale to restore humoral balance. While these treatments couldn't address underlying psychological issues, they probably provided temporary symptomatic relief. Women's health conditions received special attention from medieval physicians prescribing alcohol-based treatments. Menstrual irregularities, difficult childbirth, and postpartum recovery were all treated with various wine and ale preparations. Some of these treatments may have been genuinely helpful, as alcohol can relax muscles and reduce anxiety during labor and delivery. Digestive ailments were commonly treated with alcohol-based preparations. Medieval physicians understood that alcohol could stimulate appetite and aid digestion, making it useful for treating various gastrointestinal problems. Bitter herbal wines were particularly popular for digestive conditions, as the bitter herbs were thought to stimulate digestive functions. Respiratory conditions, including coughs, chest congestion, and breathing difficulties, were often treated with warm, spiced wine preparations. These treatments probably provided genuine symptomatic relief by reducing throat irritation and helping to loosen chest congestion. Some respiratory preparations included herbs like thyme and mint that had actual therapeutic properties. Pain management in medieval medicine relied heavily on alcohol-based preparations. For chronic pain conditions like arthritis and gout, physicians prescribed various wine and herb combinations that were thought to reduce inflammation and restore proper humoral balance. For acute pain from injuries or surgical procedures, stronger alcohol preparations provided temporary relief. The preservation of medicinal alcohol preparations required specialized knowledge and equipment. Physicians and apothecaries developed techniques for storing herbal wines and distilled spirits to maintain their potency over extended periods. Some preparations were believed to improve with age, while others had to be used quickly before they lost their therapeutic properties. The brewing industry was one of medieval Europe's largest and most important economic sectors, employing thousands of people and generating substantial tax revenues for governments. Large commercial breweries in major cities operated on industrial scales, producing thousands of gallons of ale daily and supporting complex networks of suppliers, distributors, and retailers. Investment in brewing infrastructure required substantial capital that often came from wealthy merchants, nobles, or religious institutions. Building a commercial brewery meant purchasing expensive equipment like copper kettles, wooden fermentation vessels, and specialized buildings designed for optimal brewing conditions. These investments could generate steady profits for decades, but also represented significant financial risks. The seasonal nature of brewing created complex financial challenges for medieval brewers. Peak production periods during harvest time required large expenditures for raw materials and additional labor, while income was generated over the following months as products were sold. This timing mismatch required brewers to maintain substantial cash reserves or access to credit to smooth out seasonal fluctuations. Credit relationships in the alcohol industry were extensive and complicated. Brewers borrowed money to purchase grain and equipment, tavern keepers bought ale on credit from brewers, and customers often ran tabs at their local drinking establishments. When these credit networks functioned properly, they facilitated commerce and economic growth. When they collapsed, the effects could ripple through entire communities. Tax collection from alcohol production and sales was a major source of government revenue throughout medieval Europe. Kings, nobles, and city councils all imposed various forms of alcohol taxation, from grain taxes that affected brewing costs to sales taxes collected from tavern keepers. These taxes were relatively easy to collect because alcohol production was difficult to hide. and drinking establishments were fixed locations. The relationship between alcohol taxes and government finances could influence political decisions about war, infrastructure investment, and social policy. Governments that relied heavily on alcohol tax revenues had incentives to encourage moderate drinking while discouraging excessive consumption that might reduce tax receipts. This created complex political dynamics around alcohol regulation and enforcement. International trade in alcohol generated enormous profits that financed exploration, colonization, and technological development. Wine merchants who successfully established trade routes between producing and consuming regions could accumulate vast wealth that they invested in other ventures. Some of the great medieval trading fortunes were built on alcohol commerce. The alcohol trade also influenced currency systems and banking practices. Large-scale wine and beer trades required sophisticated financial instruments to manage payments across long distances and different currency systems. Italian banking houses developed some of their most important innovations while financing alcohol trades between different European regions. Family finances were often dominated by alcohol-related expenses, both for daily consumption and for special occasions. A typical medieval household might spend 20 to 30% of its income on alcoholic beverages, making alcohol purchasing decisions crucial for family economic well-being. Poor families that overspent on alcohol could quickly slide into poverty and debt. The economic cycle of alcohol consumption created patterns of boom and bust at both household and community levels. Good harvests led to cheap alcohol and increased consumption, while poor harvests created alcohol shortages that could disrupt local economies. Communities dependent on brewing or wine production were particularly vulnerable to these agricultural cycles. Insurance and risk management in the alcohol industry were primitive but existed in various forms. Merchants trading in wine might form partnerships to share the risks of spoilage or piracy. Brewers sometimes cooperated to help members rebuild after fires or other disasters. These early forms of commercial insurance helped stabilize the alcohol industry and encourage investment. The opportunity costs of excessive drinking affected both individuals and society as a whole. Workers who spent too much money on alcohol had less to spend on other goods and services, reducing demand for non-alcohol products. Time spent drinking was time not spent on productive activities, reducing overall economic output. Social costs of alcohol abuse included increased crime, domestic violence, and public disorder that required resources to address. Communities had to support families impoverished by alcoholism and deal with the legal and social consequences of alcohol-related violence. These costs were rarely calculated systematically, but represented real drains on medieval economies. The relationship between alcohol and criminal behavior in medieval society was complex and pervasive, influencing everything from petty theft to serious violent crimes. Understanding this relationship provides insights into both medieval drinking culture and medieval approaches to law enforcement and social control. Tavern violence was perhaps the most common form of alcohol-related crime in medieval society. The combination of intoxicated men, weapons, and competitive social dynamics created frequent opportunities for fights that could escalate from verbal arguments to deadly combat. Many taverns had specific rules about weapons, requiring patrons to peace bond their swords or leave them with the proprietor. The types of weapons available in medieval taverns made violence particularly dangerous. Most men carried knives for eating and general utility, while many also carried swords or other weapons for personal protection. Alcohol reduced inhibitions and impaired judgment, making disputes more likely to escalate to deadly violence. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows high rates of violent trauma that were often alcohol-related. Theft and alcohol abuse were linked in several ways. People who spent excessive amounts on alcohol might resort to theft to obtain money for drinks or basic necessities. Intoxicated individuals were also more likely to steal impulsively or make poor decisions about property crimes. Additionally, drunk people were easy targets for thieves who could rob them with relatively little risk of resistance or identification. Domestic violence was frequently associated with alcohol abuse in medieval households. Court records and literary sources provide abundant evidence of men beating their wives and children while intoxicated. Medieval legal systems offered limited protection for victims of domestic violence, and alcohol was often seen as an explanation rather than an excuse for violent behavior. The relationship between alcohol and homicide was particularly complex in medieval society. Many murders occurred during tavern fights or domestic disputes involving alcohol, but medieval legal systems distinguished between premeditated murder and killings that occurred in the heat of passion. Alcohol-related killings were often punished less severely than calculated murders, though they still carried serious legal consequences. Professional criminals sometimes used alcohol strategically to facilitate their crimes. Thieves might buy drinks for potential victims to lower their guard, while con artists used alcohol to impair their target's judgment. Some criminal gangs operated taverns as fronts for their illegal activities, using these establishments to identify targets and plan crimes. Law enforcement in medieval society had to deal with alcohol-related crime constantly, but their resources and techniques were limited. Most communities had few professional law enforcement officers, relying instead on citizen volunteers and informal social control. Dealing with drunk and disorderly individuals required physical confrontation that could be dangerous for untrained civilians. The economic costs of alcohol-related crime affected entire communities. Violent crimes disrupted trade and social relationships, while property crimes imposed direct financial losses on victims. Communities had to support widows and orphans created by alcohol-related violence, and they had to maintain legal systems capable of dealing with alcohol-related disputes and crimes. Punishment for alcohol-related crimes varied significantly based on the social status of perpetrators and victims. Nobles who committed violent crimes while drunk might face relatively light punishment, while peasants who committed similar crimes could face severe penalties, including execution. This disparity reflected broader inequalities in medieval legal systems. The role of alcohol in medieval legal proceedings extended beyond its involvement in crimes. Witnesses who had been drinking when they observed crimes might be considered unreliable, while defendants could sometimes use intoxication as a mitigating factor in sentencing. However, some legal codes specified enhanced penalties for crimes committed while drunk. Prevention strategies for alcohol-related crime were limited, but did exist in some communities. Some authorities tried to limit the hours when taverns could operate, restrict alcohol sales during certain periods, or require tavern keepers to maintain order in their establishments. These approaches had mixed success and were often difficult to enforce consistently. The cycle of alcohol abuse and criminal behavior could be difficult to break in medieval society. People who turned to crime to support drinking habits might find themselves ostracized from legitimate employment opportunities, forcing them to rely increasingly on illegal activities. Without institutional support for addressing alcohol abuse, this cycle often continued until the individual died or was executed. The role of women in medieval alcohol culture was far more complex and important than traditional historical narratives often suggest. Women were central to alcohol production, distribution, and consumption in ways that gave them economic power, social influence, and cultural significance that extended far beyond domestic spheres. Household brewing was predominantly women's work throughout most of medieval Europe. Wives, daughters, and female servants were responsible for producing the daily ale that sustained their families and communities. This responsibility required extensive technical knowledge about grain selection, malting, fermentation, and quality control that was passed down through generations of women. The techniques of household brewing were sophisticated and varied significantly between regions and social classes. Wealthy households might have dedicated brewing facilities with expensive equipment, while poor families made do with basic pots and bowls. Regardless of their resources, women developed expertise in working with available materials to produce drinkable ale under challenging conditions. Commercial brewing offered women opportunities for economic independence that were rare in medieval society. The alewife was a recognized profession that could provide substantial income for women who developed reputations for producing high-quality products. Successful alewives might own property, employ workers, and achieve social status comparable to male craftsmen. However, female brewers faced increasing restrictions as the medieval period progressed. Male-dominated brewers' guilds gradually excluded women from large-scale commercial operations, limiting them to smaller household-based businesses. This process reflected broader trends toward restricting women's economic opportunities and concentrating profitable trades under male control. The regulation of female brewing activities revealed tensions between women's economic roles and social expectations about proper feminine behavior. Female brewers had to balance their need to promote their businesses and attract customers with expectations that respectable women should avoid excessive public visibility or aggressive commercial behavior. Women's participation in tavern culture was heavily regulated and socially scrutinized. While women worked in taverns as servers, cooks, and entertainers, their presence as customers was often viewed with suspicion. Respectable women might appear in taverns during special occasions or as part of family groups, but regular female customers were often assumed to be prostitutes or women of questionable reputation. The alewife as tavern keeper represented a special category that allowed women to participate in public drinking culture while maintaining social respectability. These women managed establishments that served both alcohol and food, providing essential services to their communities while operating legitimate businesses that could generate substantial income. Marriage negotiations sometimes included provisions about brewing responsibilities and alcohol management. Prospective wives were often evaluated based on their brewing skills and their ability to manage household alcohol supplies efficiently. A woman's reputation as a brewer could significantly enhance her attractiveness as a marriage partner. Medieval people experienced hangovers just like modern drinkers, but their understanding of what caused these unpleasant symptoms and how to treat them was based on entirely different theoretical frameworks than contemporary medical knowledge. Their remedies were creative, varied in effectiveness, and often reflected broader cultural beliefs about health, balance, and the nature of alcohol itself. Medieval medical theory attributed hangovers to disruptions in the body's humoral balance caused by excessive alcohol consumption. Since alcohol was considered hot and dry, overconsumption was thought to create too much heat and dryness in the body, leading to symptoms like headaches, thirst, and digestive upset. Treatments were designed to restore proper balance by introducing cold and moist elements. The most common hangover remedy was simply drinking more alcohol, the hair of the dog approach that remains popular today. Medieval physicians reasoned that since alcohol had created the imbalance, carefully measured additional alcohol could help restore equilibrium. This treatment was typically combined with water or other cooling substances to moderate the alcohol's heating effects. Water-based treatments were popular for addressing the dehydration that medieval doctors recognized as a major component of hangover symptoms. However, since water quality was often questionable, these treatments might involve diluted wine, herbal teas, or broths rather than plain water. Some remedies called for specific types of water, such as spring water or rainwater, believed to have special purifying properties. Herbal remedies for hangovers were numerous and varied by region and social class. Wealthy people might consume expensive imported herbs like ginger or cinnamon, while poor people relied on locally available plants like willow bark, which actually contains compounds similar to modern aspirin. Many of these herbal treatments were prepared as teas or mixed with small amounts of wine or ale. Food-based hangover treatments reflected medieval understanding of nutrition and digestion. Heavy, greasy foods were generally avoided, as they were thought to be too difficult for the weakened digestive system to process. Instead, hangover sufferers might consume light broths, thin porridge, or easily digestible foods that would provide nutrition without stressing the stomach. Religious remedies for hangovers combined spiritual and physical healing approaches. Some people attended church services or said special prayers, believing that spiritual cleansing would help restore physical health. Holy water might be consumed or applied externally, while religious relics were sometimes touched or worn to promote healing. Physical treatments for hangovers included various forms of bathing and temperature manipulation. Cold water baths were thought to cool the overheated body and restore proper temperature balance. Some remedies called for alternating hot and cold treatments, such as sitting in a hot room followed by cold water application. Bloodletting was sometimes prescribed for severe hangovers, based on the theory that removing excess blood would help rebalance the humors and eliminate toxic substances from the body. This treatment was typically reserved for wealthy patients who could afford professional medical care, as it required skilled practitioners and carried significant risks. Sleep and rest were universally recognized as important components of hangover recovery. Medieval people understood that the body needed time to recover from excessive alcohol consumption, though they attributed this need to humoral rebalancing rather than modern concepts like alcohol metabolism and cellular repair. Professional hangover treatments were available from physicians and apothecaries who specialized in treating the effects of overindulgence. These practitioners developed complex remedies that might include multiple herbs, specific timing of administration, and detailed dietary instructions. Such professional treatment was expensive and mainly available to wealthy customers. Prevention strategies were also part of medieval hangover management. Experienced drinkers learned to consume specific foods before or during drinking sessions to reduce the likelihood of severe hangover symptoms. Bread, cheese, and fatty foods were thought to provide protection against alcohol's harmful effects. The social context of hangover recovery was important in medieval culture. Friends and family members were expected to provide care and support for hangover sufferers, both out of sympathy and as preparation for receiving similar help when their own overindulgence created problems. This reciprocal support system helped maintain social bonds while managing the practical consequences of heavy drinking. Regional variations in hangover remedies reflected different cultural traditions and available resources. Mediterranean regions might emphasize wine-based treatments and herbs like rosemary, while Northern European remedies featured ale-based preparations and locally available plants. These regional differences created diverse traditions that influenced hangover treatment for centuries. The effectiveness of medieval hangover remedies varied considerably. Some treatments, like herbal preparations containing willow bark or adequate hydration, probably provided genuine relief. Others, like bloodletting or consuming raw eggs, were likely ineffective or even harmful. However, the placebo effect probably made many treatments more helpful than their actual ingredients would suggest. The relationship between alcohol and warfare in medieval times was complex and multifaceted, influencing everything from soldier morale and battlefield performance to military logistics and strategic planning. Understanding this relationship provides insights into both medieval military culture and the practical challenges of organizing and sustaining armed forces in pre-modern conditions. Army provisioning included alcohol as an essential supply item rather than a luxury. Military commanders understood that providing regular rations of ale, wine, or other alcoholic beverages was crucial for maintaining troop morale and preventing desertion. Soldiers expected these rations as part of their compensation, and armies that failed to provide adequate alcohol supplies often experienced discipline problems. The logistics of supplying alcohol to medieval armies were enormous and complex. Wine and ale were heavy, required special containers for transport, and spoiled quickly under poor storage conditions. Military campaigns had to include provisions for transporting brewing equipment, finding suitable water sources, and protecting alcohol supplies from enemy raids or accidental loss. Alcohol consumption before battles was a common practice that served multiple psychological and cultural functions. Moderate drinking helped reduce anxiety and fear among soldiers facing possible death or serious injury. It also reinforced group bonds and shared identity among troops who drank together before engaging in combat. However, excessive pre-battle drinking could be disastrous for military effectiveness. Intoxicated soldiers might break formation, ignore orders, or make tactical mistakes that endangered themselves and their comrades. Experienced military commanders learned to balance the morale benefits of pre-battle drinking with the risks of reduced combat effectiveness. Naval warfare presented special challenges related to alcohol consumption and management. Ships' crews expected daily alcohol rations as part of their compensation, but excessive drinking could be particularly dangerous in the confined environment of a ship. Naval commanders had to maintain discipline while providing enough alcohol to keep crews satisfied and prevent mutiny. Siege warfare created unique situations where alcohol played important strategic roles. Besieging armies needed to maintain their own alcohol supplies over extended periods while attempting to cut off defenders' access to food and drink. Defenders might use alcohol strategically to maintain morale during long sieges or to celebrate successful resistance to attacks. The capture and control of brewing and winemaking facilities could be important military objectives. Armies that captured intact breweries or wine cellars gained valuable resources for maintaining their own forces while denying these resources to enemies. Some medieval campaigns included specific objectives related to controlling alcohol production facilities. Mercenary forces had different relationships with alcohol than feudal armies composed of traditional military obligations. Professional soldiers often demanded higher quality alcohol rations and more regular supplies as part of their contracts. This created additional logistical challenges, but also provided military commanders with more reliable and experienced troops. Alcohol-related discipline problems were constant challenges for medieval military commanders. Drunk soldiers might commit crimes against civilians, desert their posts, or engage in fights with fellow soldiers. Military legal systems developed specific punishments for alcohol-related offences, ranging from reduced rations to corporal punishment or execution. The economic costs of providing alcohol to armies were substantial and had to be factored into military planning. Large armies consumed enormous quantities of alcoholic beverages daily, creating expenses that could strain royal treasuries or force military commanders to reduce other expenditures. Some campaigns failed partly due to inability to maintain adequate alcohol supplies. Victory celebrations typically involved heavy drinking that could create new problems for military commanders. Soldiers who had survived battles often felt entitled to celebrate with excessive alcohol consumption, but such celebrations could leave armies vulnerable to surprise attacks or make it difficult to maintain discipline and organization. Medical applications of alcohol in military contexts were important for treating wounded soldiers and maintaining army health. Military surgeons used wine and distilled spirits as antiseptics for cleaning wounds and as anesthetics for surgical procedures. Alcohol-based medicines were also used to treat various camp diseases and medical conditions. The cultural significance of alcohol in military contexts extended beyond practical considerations to symbolic and ritual functions. Sharing drinks reinforced bonds between soldiers and commanders, while ritualized drinking ceremonies marked important military occasions like the beginning of campaigns or the celebration of victories. International aspects of military alcohol supply created diplomatic and economic complications. Armies operating in foreign territories might need to negotiate for local alcohol supplies or arrange for imports from friendly regions. These negotiations could influence diplomatic relationships and create dependencies that affected military strategy. The introduction of distillation technology to medieval Europe revolutionized alcohol production and consumption, creating new types of beverages with unprecedented potency and opening up possibilities for both medical and recreational uses that fundamentally changed European drinking culture. Distillation technology arrived in medieval Europe through contact with the Islamic world, where it had been developed for various purposes including perfume production, chemical processes, and the creation of medicinal preparations. The first European distillers were often scholars or physicians who had encountered Islamic texts describing distillation techniques and equipment. The theoretical understanding of distillation in medieval Europe was based on alchemical principles rather than modern chemistry. Medieval practitioners believed that distillation separated and concentrated the essential spirits or essences of substances, creating purified products that retained the most potent qualities of the original materials. Early distillation equipment in medieval Europe was primitive but functional. Distillers used simple apparatus consisting of a heating vessel, a condensing chamber, and connecting tubes that allowed alcohol vapors to be captured and converted back to liquid form. These devices were often handmade by local craftsmen working from written descriptions or crude diagrams. The first distilled beverages produced in medieval Europe were considered medicines rather than recreational drinks. Aqua vitae, literally water of life, was believed to have miraculous healing properties that could cure diseases, extend life, and restore youth. Medical texts claimed that distilled spirits could prevent plague, heal wounds, and treat a wide variety of ailments. The production process for early distilled spirits was time-consuming and required considerable skill and knowledge. Distillers had to understand how to control temperature, timing, and other variables to produce consistent results. Many early attempts at distillation resulted in products that were undrinkable or even dangerous due to contamination or excessive alcohol content. Quality control in medieval spirit production was challenging because distillers lacked modern tools for measuring alcohol content or detecting impurities. They relied on sensory evaluation, traditional knowledge, and sometimes dangerous trial and error methods to assess the quality and safety of their products. Some distilled beverages were probably closer to industrial alcohol than drinking alcohol. The economic impact of distillation technology was substantial, but took time to develop. Initially, distilled spirits were luxury products available only to wealthy customers who could afford the expensive equipment and time-intensive production process. As the technology improved and became more widespread, distilled beverages became more accessible to broader segments of society. Regional variations in distillation practices reflected different cultural traditions, available raw materials, and levels of technical knowledge. Italian distillers often worked with grape-based wines, while Northern European distillers experimented with grain-based ales and various fermented fruit preparations. These regional differences led to distinctive styles that influenced later spirit production. The Church's relationship with distillation was complex and sometimes contradictory. While many monasteries became centers of distillation knowledge and production, Church authorities were often suspicious of practices that seemed too closely related to alchemy or magic. Some religious leaders worried that distillation represented an attempt to improve upon God's natural creation. Legal and regulatory challenges emerged as distilled spirits became more common. Existing laws governing alcohol production and sales weren't designed to handle beverages with much higher alcohol content than traditional wine and ale. Governments had to develop new approaches to taxation, quality control, and public safety related to spirit production and consumption. The social impact of distilled spirits included both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, distillation created new economic opportunities and provided more effective medicines for treating various conditions. On the other hand, the high alcohol content of distilled beverages made it easier for people to become severely intoxicated, creating new forms of social problems and alcohol abuse. International trade in distilled spirits developed slowly but eventually became important for certain regions. Italian aqua vitae, German brandewine, and other regional spirits found markets in distant countries where they were valued for their medicinal properties and exotic character. This trade helped spread distillation knowledge and techniques across Europe. Innovation in distillation technology continued throughout the medieval period as practitioners learned to improve their equipment and techniques. Multiple distillation, the use of different materials for condensing chambers, and experimentation with various heating methods all contributed to producing higher quality and more consistent distilled beverages. The transition from medicinal to recreational use of distilled spirits happened gradually and varied by region and social class. Wealthy individuals who could afford high-quality distilled beverages began consuming them for pleasure rather than medical necessity, while poor people continued to view spirits primarily as medicines or special occasion drinks. As we reach the end of our journey through the taverns, monasteries, and great halls of medieval Europe, it's worth reflecting on how profoundly medieval drinking culture influenced the development of European civilization and continues to shape modern relationships with alcohol. The fundamental patterns established in medieval times, the integration of alcohol into daily life, the association of drinking with social bonding and celebration, the use of alcohol for medical purposes, all became deeply embedded in European culture and spread throughout the world through colonization, immigration, and cultural exchange. The technological innovations developed by medieval brewers, vintners, and distillers laid the foundation for modern alcohol production. Techniques for malting grain, controlling fermentation, aging wine, and distilling spirits that were perfected in medieval monasteries and commercial operations remained largely unchanged until the Industrial Revolution. Some traditional methods are still used today by artisanal producers seeking to recreate historical flavors and qualities. The economic structures that emerged around alcohol production and trade in medieval times established patterns that influenced commercial development for centuries. The concept of brand identity, quality control, international trade networks, and commercial credit systems all developed partly through the alcohol industry's needs and opportunities. Many of the world's oldest continuous businesses are breweries, wineries, and distilleries that trace their origins to medieval operations. The social rituals surrounding alcohol consumption that developed in medieval times continue to influence modern drinking culture. Toasting, round buying, celebration drinking, and the association of alcohol with hospitality all have medieval origins. Even modern concerns about alcohol abuse, drunk driving, and social drinking problems echo medieval struggles to balance alcohol's benefits with its potential for causing harm. The legal frameworks that emerged to regulate alcohol production, sale, and consumption in medieval times established precedents that continue to influence modern alcohol policy. The concepts of licensing, quality standards, taxation, and public safety regulation all have medieval origins, though they've been adapted to address modern circumstances and understanding. Religious attitudes toward alcohol that developed during the medieval period continue to influence contemporary debates about drinking. The tension between alcohol as a positive part of social and spiritual life versus alcohol as a source of moral corruption and social problems reflects medieval theological discussions that remain relevant today. The medical understanding of alcohol's effects on health that began in medieval times has evolved dramatically with modern scientific knowledge, but some medieval insights about alcohol's therapeutic properties have been validated by contemporary research. The medieval recognition that moderate alcohol consumption could have health benefits while excessive consumption caused serious problems remains fundamentally accurate. The relationship between alcohol and creativity that was recognized in medieval times, the association between drinking and storytelling, music, poetry, and artistic expression remains an important aspect of contemporary culture. Many of the world's greatest artists, writers, and musicians have continued the medieval tradition of finding inspiration in alcohol, though modern understanding of alcohol's effects on creativity is more nuanced. The environmental impact of alcohol production that began to be significant during the medieval period has become a major contemporary concern. Medieval deforestation for fuel and barrel making, water pollution from brewing and distilling operations, and agricultural pressure from grain and grape production established patterns of environmental impact that continue to challenge modern alcohol producers. The international political implications of alcohol trade that emerged during medieval times continue to influence global politics. Trade relationships, economic dependencies, and cultural exchanges based on alcohol production and consumption still affect international relations, though they're often overshadowed by modern energy, technology, and financial connections. Perhaps most fundamentally, the medieval period established alcohol as a central element of European civilization in ways that continue to influence how people think about drinking, socializing, celebrating, and even healing. The complexity of medieval drinking culture, its integration of practical, social, economic, religious, and cultural functions, created a template for understanding alcohol's role in human society that remains relevant today. Medieval people developed sophisticated approaches to managing alcohol's benefits while minimizing its risks, creating social institutions and cultural practices that helped maintain the delicate balance between alcohol's positive and negative effects. While modern technology and knowledge have changed many aspects of alcohol production and consumption, the fundamental challenge of maximizing alcohol's benefits while minimizing its harms remains the same. The stories of medieval drinkers, the alewives and monks, the tavern keepers and nobles, the physicians and peasants who all participated in the complex culture surrounding alcohol, remind us that people throughout history have faced similar challenges in creating meaningful, sustainable relationships with intoxicating substances. Their successes and failures, innovations and traditions provide valuable insights for contemporary efforts to understand and manage alcohol's continuing role in human society. As we close this exploration of medieval drinking culture, we're reminded that history isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing the continuities and changes that connect us with previous generations and help us navigate contemporary challenges. The medieval drinkers, whose stories we've explored tonight, faced many of the same fundamental questions about alcohol that we continue to grapple with today. How much is too much? How do we balance individual freedom with social responsibility? How do we maximize the pleasures and benefits of drinking while minimizing the risks and harms? Their answers, shaped by their own time and circumstances, may not always be directly applicable to our modern situation, but their experiences, their innovations, their struggles, and their insights continue to offer valuable perspectives on these enduring human questions. In understanding how medieval people approached drinking, we gain not just historical knowledge but also wisdom that can inform our own relationships with alcohol and help us create more thoughtful, sustainable drinking cultures for the future. And with that reflection, we've reached the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating, complex, and surprisingly sophisticated world of medieval drinking culture. I hope you found it as enlightening as I have, and that perhaps you'll never look at your evening drink quite the same way again. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, whether you're raising a glass of wine, a mug of ale, or a cup of tea, you're participating in traditions that stretch back through centuries of human culture and community. Sweet dreams, everyone.